August 6, 1945. An ordinary Monday morning in Japan. People heading to work. And then, in a fraction of a second, the sky falls. At the exact points of explosion, the temperature instantly spiked to between 3,000 and 4,000 degrees Celsius. It was as if a piece of the sun had been dragged down to touch the earth, instantly incinerating hundreds of thousands of lives. This chart breaks down the human cost of the conflict. Out of the roughly 60 to 80 million people who died worldwide, 50 million were civilians. Notice how civilian numbers completely dwarf military losses, a sharp spike compared to previous conflicts. This happened because the concept of the battlefield was intentionally erased. The distinction between a soldier and a citizen was entirely removed. This is the brutal math of total war. To understand how humanity built a machine capable of nearly destroying itself, we have to rewind. We have to look at how a fractured, desperate society was weaponized from the inside out. The groundwork for this conflict was laid at the end of the First World War. Under the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the victorious nations carved up Germany, stripped away its military, and saddled it with staggering financial reparations. To pay those debts, the struggling German government simply printed more money. Hyperinflation spiraled so completely out of control that actual paper currency became cheaper than toys. Kids built blocks out of cash, while their parents couldn't afford a single loaf of bread. America tried to throw Germany a financial lifeline, but that was cut short by the 1929 Wall Street crash. As global markets collapsed, international loans vanished, and roughly 6 million Germans found themselves suddenly unemployed and protesting in the streets. A failed artist and political agitator named Adolf Hitler capitalized on that exact desperation. Through a calculated campaign of aggressive speeches and populist promises, he vowed to rip up the Treaty of Versailles. By 1933, the German state had granted him absolute dictatorial control. He rapidly rebuilt the nation's military and, in September 1939, sent his forces crashing through the borders of Poland. France and the UK, bound by treaties to defend the Polish borders, immediately declared war. The League of Nations, established specifically to prevent another global conflict through peaceful diplomacy, could only watch. A society completely retrofitted into a war machine cannot be stopped by a strongly worded resolution. This map shows how the globe quickly fractured into two opposing industrial alliances, the Axis powers and the Allied powers. Every factory, farm, and scientific laboratory in these nations was forcibly redirected to serve the war effort. Because the factories were powering the armies, the factories became the primary targets. Militaries stopped limiting their attacks to battlefields and began dropping bombs directly onto public infrastructure, hospitals, and dense urban neighborhoods, calculating that destroying civilian morale would cripple the enemy's economy. Hitler eventually turned this machinery toward the Soviet Union. It was a fatal miscalculation. The extreme freezing conditions of the Russian winter and the sheer size of the Soviet army brought the German advance to a brutal, grinding halt. To feed this expanding meat grinder, imperial powers reached deep into their overseas territories. Millions of colonial subjects, including over 2 million Indian soldiers under British rule, were pulled from their homes to fight and die on foreign soil. The British government systematically redirected India's grain and raw materials to the front lines, prioritizing military supply over local survival. This aggressive export policy triggered the 1943 Bengal famine, which killed an estimated 3 million people through starvation and disease. When a nation commits to total war, the ripple effects are lethal everywhere. A local laborer or farmer, thousands of miles from the front lines, was just as likely to die from the conflict's economic drain as a rifleman was from a bullet. The Axis powers ultimately guaranteed their own destruction through overreach. In the Pacific, Japan launched a surprise bombing campaign on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, instantly dragging the immense industrial weight of America directly into the conflict. Pushed back by the Soviets in the east and by American and British forces in the west, the German military collapsed. As Soviet troops fought their way into the rubble of Berlin, Hitler took his own life, closing the European theater of the war. Yet the violence continued in the Pacific until the United States deployed its newly developed nuclear weapons over Japan. It was the terrifying, logical conclusion to total war. the mechanical ability to instantly delete an entire city with the push of a single button. This map illustrates the immediate geopolitical fallout. The victorious Allied powers carved up the physical ruins of Germany, splitting it into a Soviet-controlled East and an Allied-controlled West. That very dividing line would soon lock the two remaining superpowers into a decades-long Cold War. The conflict also broke the back of global imperialism. The European empires emerged victorious, but entirely bankrupt and exhausted, lacking the resources to suppress massive nationalist movements. Across Africa and Asia, long-exploited colonies finally forced their way to independence. Recognizing the catastrophic failure of the League of Nations, the surviving powers established the United Nations. This time, the organization was built with actual structural teeth and heavier enforcement mechanisms to actively maintain global peace. In the end, the conflict proved exactly what an industrialized global society is capable of. Once every resource, every factory, and every citizen is turned into a weapon, humanity possesses the tools to erase itself entirely, a stark reality that continues to dictate how the world operates to this day.